brutal reality of medieval existence. Tonight we begin with something truly horrifying, a journey through the darkest era of human existence. We're diving deep into medieval life, but not the sanitized fairy tale version with gallant knights and swooning maidens you've seen in movies. No, we're exploring the raw, putrid reality that would make even the most hardened among us beg for mercy within days. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy these unfiltered glimpses into history's most brutal chapters. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always fascinated to see which corners of our comfortable modern world are about to glimpse the horrors our ancestors endured. Tonight, I'll take you through the complete medieval life cycle, from the blood-soaked agony of childbirth, where survival was a coin flip for both mother and infant, through the merciless gauntlet of childhood, where half never reached their 5th birthday. We'll experience the backbreaking daily existence of medieval adults, whose bodies were used up and discarded like broken tools by age 30. You'll discover what medieval people actually ate. Spoiler alert, it wasn't turkey legs at Renaissance fairs, but rather a grim parade of moldy bread, mysterious pottage, and whatever half-rotten scraps you could scavenge. We'll explore the horrifying toilet situation. Hope you're not eating while watching this. The medieval body with its catalog of parasites and pain, and the brutal justice system that turned human suffering into public entertainment. By the time we reach the medieval deathbed, which you'd be lucky to survive to age 40 to experience, you'll understand why the average peasant viewed death not as tragedy, but as sweet release. So dim the lights and prepare yourself. The medieval world you're about to experience isn't just uncomfortable. It's a relentless assault on every sense that will make you profoundly grateful to be living now. The stench alone would make you vomit within minutes, but that's merely the beginning of your problems. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1348. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, everything else. The sounds of your sleeping companions create a medieval symphony. Your father's hacking cough from decades of smoke inhalation. Your sister's whimpers as fleas feast on her blood. The scurrying of rats, bold enough to nibble your toes. And the constant, maddening scratching as everyone battles the lice that consider your family's scalps their ancestral homeland. The smell that surrounds you would knock a modern person unconscious. A putrid cocktail of unwashed bodies, the open waste bucket in the corner, yesterday's pottage still bubbling in a pot, smoke from the dying hearth fire, and the damp, moldy stench of the earth floor beneath you that has absorbed generations of spills, waste, and rot. Sleep itself is broken into segments unknown to modern humans. You don't enjoy a straight 8 hours of blissful unconsciousness. Medieval sleep comes in shifts, a few hours after sunset, then a waking period called the watching, where prayers are said and neighbors visited by candlelight, followed by a second sleep until dawn. This fragmented rest is all your body can expect before another day of backbreaking labor. But enjoy these moments of fitful slumber while you can. In a few hours, the church bells will pierce the darkness, calling you to pre-dawn prayers. You'll drag your aching body from this pathetic excuse for a bed and begin another day in a world where merely surviving to sunset counts as success. Welcome to medieval existence, where even sleep offers no real escape from the waking nightmare of daily life. The filth, pain, hunger, and terror that define your days follow you into the night, and the morning promises only more of the same: birth, childhood, and the brutal beginning. Entering a world that wants you dead. Congratulations, your mother is in labor in the year 1320. The chances of you both surviving the next 24 hours hover somewhere between terrifying and catastrophic. The birthing chamber is no sterile hospital room with fetal monitors and pain management. It's the same smoke-filled, vermin-infested single room where your family lives, cooks, and sleeps. The windows, if there are any, remain tightly shuttered because medieval medical wisdom holds that fresh air is dangerous for women in labor. The resulting atmosphere is a suffocating miasma of wood smoke, body odor, and the metallic scent of blood. Your mother isn't attended by an obstetrician, or even a dedicated midwife. In most villages, the midwife is simply whichever older woman has delivered the most babies without killing them. Her hands, moving from your mother's birth canal to your emerging head, haven't been washed. the concept of germs remains centuries away. Those same hands might have been mucking animal stalls preparing food or handling waste just hours earlier. Pain management? Your mother might be given a piece of wood to bite down on. If she's lucky, perhaps some ale or a decoction of herbs with mild sedative properties. Mostly, she's expected to endure. Medieval religious thought often framed the agony of childbirth as Eve's curse, women's rightful punishment for original sin. To ease this divinely mandated suffering might border on blasphemy. If you're positioned incorrectly in the womb, breech, transverse, or with the umbilical cord wrapped around your neck, there are no emergency C-sections. The midwife might attempt to physically turn you by manipulating your mother's abdomen, a procedure excruciating for her and potentially fatal for you both. Tools of last resort include hooks and crochets designed to extract you piece by piece, if necessary, prioritizing the mother's survival. Should your mother's labor stall, attendants might force her to walk until she collapses, shake her violently, or even bounce her up and down to dislodge you. These desperate measures often kill both mother and child. Hemorrhage, infection, exhaustion, and trauma claim countless women during or shortly after childbirth. In some regions, during certain periods, the maternal death rate approached 1 in 10 births, and women might endure a dozen or more pregnancies during their reproductive years. But against the odds, let's say you emerge into the world alive. No one gently suctions your airways with a blue rubber bulb. The midwife might scoop mucus from your mouth with her finger, or even suck it out with her own mouth before spitting it aside. You're not placed on your mother's chest for bonding. You're quickly assessed for viability. This assessment is brutally pragmatic. Deformed infants might be allowed to die through neglect, or actively killed as changelings or demonic substitutions. Even in less extreme cases, parents make cold calculations about resources. Another mouth to feed means less food for existing children. Your arrival isn't just a blessing, it's a potential threat to family survival. If you pass this initial inspection, you're tightly swaddled, not in soft cotton, but in coarse linen strips that bind your arms straight against your sides and your legs together. Medieval wisdom holds that human babies are born with soft limbs that must be straightened and hardened through constant binding. You'll remain wrapped like this for most of your first year, your tiny body sometimes strapped to a board to ensure perfect rigidity while your mother works. Your first meal isn't carefully formulated newborn formula or even guaranteed breast milk. While breastfeeding is the norm, not all women produce sufficient milk, especially those who are themselves malnourished. Medieval wet nurses might serve noble families, but peasant infants with mothers unable to nurse face grim alternatives: animal milk, without sterilization or refrigeration, pre-chewed food pushed into their mouths, or thin-grained gruels. Many starve while technically being fed. Your christening comes quickly, often within days of birth. This urgency stems not from religious fervor, but from the statistical reality that you might die at any moment. Medieval parents rush to ensure their children won't suffer eternity in limbo, the fate of the unbaptized. Some priests even perform emergency baptisms on infants partially emerged from the birth canal when delivery appears unlikely to end with a living child. Surviving childhood, a game of deadly odds. If you've survived birth, your odds remain grim. Approximately 30% of medieval children die before age 5, with the most dangerous period being the first year of life. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, and exposure claim them in numbers that would constitute a humanitarian crisis by modern standards. Parents develop psychological defenses against this heartbreaking reality. Many won't even name a child until it demonstrates some likelihood of survival, referring to newborns simply as it or the infant. Emotional attachment is a luxury few can afford when child mortality is an everyday occurrence. Noble families might send children to be raised by others, partly for education and alliance building, but also creating emotional distance that makes loss more bearable. Your medieval childhood bears no resemblance to the protected, education-focused experience of modern children. There are no developmentally appropriate toys, no picture books, no carefully child-proofed environments. Your playthings, if you have any, are crude wooden figures, discarded household items, or simply sticks and stones. More importantly, play itself is a secondary consideration, something snatched in brief moments between chores. Work begins astonishingly early. By age 4 or 5, you're assigned tasks suited to your size, scaring birds from crops, gathering kindling, watching younger siblings, collecting eggs, or picking stones from fields. By 7, you're considered capable of meaningful labor. Boys follow fathers to fields or workshops. Girls begin the endless cycle of domestic labor that will define their lives. The concept of childhood as a special, protected time for growth and learning simply doesn't exist. Education, if you receive any, is brutally practical. Peasant children learn by doing, watching adults perform tasks, then attempting them with increasing responsibility. Literacy is rare and considered unnecessary for most medieval people. Noble children might learn reading and writing, but their education focuses primarily on skills appropriate to their station. Warfare and land management for boys, household supervision, and needlework for girls. Discipline would shock modern sensibilities. The rod is never spared. Medieval parenting manuals explicitly recommend regular beatings to properly form a child's character. These aren't gentle taps, but full-force blows with switches, belts, or specialized implements. Such treatment isn't considered abuse, but essential training, administered by parents, teachers, masters, and any adult who catches a child misbehaving. A medieval childhood is a gauntlet of hard labor, harsh punishment, minimal education, and constant reminders that you exist to serve family, Lord, and God, in that order. Disease stalks you relentlessly. Without vaccines, antibiotics, or meaningful public health measures, ordinary childhood illnesses become deadly lotteries. Measles, smallpox, whooping cough, and countless fevers sweep through communities, carrying off children in devastating numbers. Survivors often bear lifelong scars or disabilities: blindness from measles, disfigurement from smallpox, damaged lungs from respiratory infections. Parasitic infections are nearly universal. Playing in soil fertilized with human waste guarantees exposure to roundworms, hookworms, and other intestinal parasites that silently steal nutrients from your growing body. These infestations cause stunted growth, cognitive impairment, chronic diarrhea, and persistent weakness, all considered normal aspects of childhood rather than treatable conditions. Accidents claim countless children. Toddlers fall into hearth fires, resulting in horrific burns that, if not immediately fatal, often lead to disfigurement and deadly infections. Drowning is common near wells and streams. Farm implements claim fingers, hands, and lives when placed in small, untrained hands. Medieval parents cannot watch their children with the helicopter precision of modern caregivers. There's too much work to be done, and fatalism about child survival runs deep. For those reaching adolescence, and many don't, adult responsibilities arrive with crushing speed. Girls from noble families might marry as young as 12, becoming mothers when their bodies are barely developed, with predictably dangerous outcomes during childbirth. Peasant girls typically marry later, not from concern for their development, but because they need time to work and save for dowries. Boys become fully responsible economic contributors by their early teens, performing adult workloads despite still growing bodies. Apprenticeships formally begin around age 7 to 14, binding children to masters who have complete authority over them. The lucky ones find kind masters who teach well and administer reasonable discipline. The unlucky face years of abuse, exploitation, and effective slavery with no recourse or escape. The brutal reality of medieval childhood creates individuals adapted to hardship in ways modern humans would find difficult to comprehend. By age 15, a medieval person has witnessed more death, experienced more physical pain, performed more labor, and faced more real threats to survival than many modern people encounter in a lifetime. This early confrontation with mortality and suffering creates a psychological landscape utterly foreign to modern minds, one where constant hardship is simply the expected state of existence rather than an exception to be remedied. You've survived childhood against overwhelming odds. Your reward? Decades of backbreaking labor, uncertain food supplies, constant physical pain, and watching many of your own children follow the same perilous path, with many not surviving it. Welcome to adulthood in medieval Europe, where your suffering has only just begun. Daily suffering, the medieval home and body. Home, putrid home, medieval living conditions. Forget your modern notions of home as a sanctuary, a clean and comfortable private space. The medieval home is a multi-purpose survival pod that barely protects its inhabitants from the elements while introducing its own unique health hazards. Privacy, comfort, and cleanliness are concepts so foreign they might as well be from another planet. For the average peasant, home is a single-room structure with walls made of wattle and daub, a lattice of sticks plastered with a mixture of mud, clay, animal dung, and straw. The roof is thatched, a thick layering of reeds or straw that provides decent protection when new, but deteriorates into a moldy, leaking mess within a few years. Replacing it is expensive and labor-intensive, so most families live with increasingly ineffective roofing until it becomes catastrophic. The floor beneath your feet isn't hardwood or tile or even concrete. It's packed earth, perhaps strewn with rushes, or straw that remains in place for months, accumulating dropped food, spit, mud, animal waste, and a thriving ecosystem of fleas and other insects. In more prosperous homes, these rushes might be replaced seasonally. In poorer dwellings, they remain until they practically decompose in place, creating a fermenting carpet of biological material that smells like a neglected compost heap. Windows? Glass is prohibitively expensive. Your options are open holes covered with shutters, oiled parchment, or thin animal horn if you're relatively wealthy, or simply gaps in the wall structure. Either way, your home is drafty in winter and swarming with insects in summer. These openings provide minimal light. Medieval interiors are cave-like, illuminated mainly by the central hearth fire and perhaps sparse rushlights or tallow candles that fill the space with acrid smoke. Speaking of smoke, it's your constant companion. The hearth typically occupies the center of your single room, with smoke rising toward a hole in the roof. Theoretically, at least. In practice, much of it lingers, filling the space with eye-watering, lung-scarring wood smoke that deposits a layer of greasy soot on everything and everyone. This persistent smoke exposure causes chronic respiratory issues, eye inflammation, and even carbon monoxide poisoning when ventilation is poor. You share this single room with your entire family, parents, children, possibly grandparents, or unmarried siblings. Everyone sleeps, eats, works, argues, falls ill, and sometimes dies in this shared space. The concept of bedrooms doesn't exist for common people. At night, you might sleep on straw-filled mattresses laid directly on that flea-infested floor, or on slightly elevated platforms if you're fortunate. Several people typically share each sleeping space for warmth, and because bedding itself is valuable. Your home is also your workplace. Depending on your trade, this might mean animal hides being tanned, a process involving urine and feces, cloth being woven, food being processed, all activities generating their own specific stenches and waste products inside your living space. The distinction between domestic and work environments simply doesn't exist. Then there are your roommates, not just human family members, but livestock. In colder regions especially, valuable animals often share human dwellings during winter. Chickens roost on rafters, dropping waste wherever they please. Pigs, goats, or cows might occupy a section of the home demarcated by a half wall or simply a rope. They provide valuable body heat, but also contribute dramatically to the indoor pollution with their waste and parasites. The smell inside a medieval home would incapacitate modern humans with untrained noses. It's a symphony of horrific odors: wood smoke, unwashed bodies, cooking, animal dung, human waste, rotting thatch, moldy straw, and the specific stench of whatever cottage industry occupies the family. This isn't just unpleasant, it's your personal olfactory fingerprint, so pervasive that you become nose-blind to your own environment, while being able to identify other households by their unique aromatic profiles. Infestation is a fact of life. Mice and rats share your space, feeding on stores and spreading disease. Cockroaches and other insects thrive in the warm, food-rich environment. Bedbugs, fleas, and lice make homes in bedding, clothing, hair, and beards. These aren't occasional visitors, but permanent cohabitants that you periodically attempt to reduce through largely ineffective means. The concept of completely eliminating household pests would seem as fantastical to medieval people as time travel seems to us. Urban dwellings might offer slightly improved construction, perhaps actual timber frames with second stories, but introduce their own problems. Houses lean over narrowing streets, blocking light and air. Close proximity means neighbors' waste, noise, and occasionally fires become your immediate concern. Townhouses might have cellars that regularly flood with a mix of groundwater and sewage from nearby cesspits, creating toxic environments that contemporary documents describe with horror. Water must be carried into the home from wells, streams, or public fountains, a daily labor that falls primarily to women and children. This water, often contaminated from the start, sits in open containers, gathering dust, insects, and whatever else falls in. The concept of a fresh glass of water simply doesn't exist. Your beverage options are all mildly alcoholic by necessity, as fermentation provides some protection against waterborne pathogens. Waste management is primitive at best. Many homes use chamber pots that must be emptied manually into cesspits, nearby bodies of water, or simply onto garden plots as fertilizer. These receptacles often remain inside the home for hours, adding their contribution to the olfactory assault. More prosperous dwellings might have a garderobe, essentially a protruding closet, with a hole opening directly to the outside, dropping waste onto the ground below or into a moat or cesspit. The medieval home isn't designed for comfort or health. It's a barely adequate shelter that often introduces as many health risks as it mitigates. It's a place to avoid freezing or drowning, to store meager possessions, and to perform necessary indoor work. The concept of home sweet home would be incomprehensible to people for whom domestic space is just another venue for the constant struggle to survive. The medieval body, a walking catalog of suffering. Your body in medieval Europe isn't the relatively clean, generally healthy, medically maintained vessel you enjoy in modern times. It's a battlefield, a torture chamber, and a petri dish, all contained within your increasingly leathery skin. A detailed inventory of the medieval body would read like a medical horror story. Let's start at the top. Your head is home to a thriving ecosystem of parasites. Head lice are so common, they're barely worth mentioning. Everyone has them, from peasants to kings. They nest in your hair, lay eggs, nits, attached to the shafts, and feed on your blood, causing constant itching that medieval people accept as a normal part of existence. You combat them with special fine-toothed combs and occasional applications of mercury-based ointments that are nearly as dangerous as they are ineffective. Your face tells the story of your hard life. By 30, sun exposure and malnutrition have weathered your skin into leather. Women who survive multiple pregnancies often lose teeth with each child as the developing fetus leaches calcium from their bodies. Men's faces bear scars from workplace accidents, fights, and the occasional battlefield wound if they've been conscripted for war. Smallpox, if you've survived it, has likely left your face permanently disfigured with pitted scars. Your mouth is a horror show by modern standards. Without toothbrushes, fluoride, or dental care beyond occasional picking with slivers of wood, your teeth begin rotting in childhood. By adulthood, many are black stumps or entirely gone, leaving painful, often infected gaps. Abscesses form regularly, creating pockets of agony in your jaw that you treat by either having the tooth pulled without anesthesia or applying hot needles directly to the nerve to kill it, trading acute pain for chronic dull pain. Your breath smells putrid from rotting teeth, gum disease, and particles of yesterday's meals lodged in dental crevices. The wealthy might chew herbs like mint or anise to mask the smell temporarily, but nobody escapes the dental nightmare of medieval life. By 40, many people are effectively toothless, forcing them to exist on increasingly soft foods that further compromise their nutrition. Your body odor deserves special mention. Without regular bathing, discouraged by many medical and religious authorities who believed it opened the skin to disease, without deodorant, without frequent clothing changes, the medieval human emits a powerful stench. This isn't just a modern judgment. Medieval people themselves recognized extreme cases of body odor, though their baseline for normal would horrify modern sensibilities. Skin conditions plague you constantly. The combination of poor nutrition, minimal hygiene, woolen clothing that rarely gets washed, and close contact with others creates perfect conditions for fungal infections, scabies, boils, and rashes of all descriptions. These aren't medically treated, but often left to run their course or addressed with herbal poultices of varying effectiveness. Many medieval people live their entire lives with chronically inflamed, itching skin that never fully heals. Inside your medieval body, the situation is equally dire. Your digestive system hosts a thriving metropolis of parasites, roundworms, tapeworms, and hookworms, absorbed from contaminated food and water. These unwelcome guests steal nutrients, cause chronic diarrhea or constipation, and occasionally migrate to other organs with deadly consequences. A heavy tapeworm infestation can make food pass through you without nourishing you, leaving you starving despite eating regular meals. Your lungs suffer from a lifetime of smoke exposure. Medieval homes, lacking proper chimneys, filled with smoke from cooking fires and heating braziers. This chronic exposure leads to persistent coughs, increased susceptibility to respiratory infections, and conditions similar to modern COPD. Certain occupations, mining, milling, tanning, accelerate this damage through exposure to specific particles and chemicals. Your cardiovascular system struggles with a diet high in salt, used for food preservation, and animal fats but low in fresh fruits and vegetables for much of the year. Hypertension and atherosclerosis are common, leading to strokes and heart attacks, though medieval people don't understand these mechanisms, attributing sudden deaths to apoplexy or God's will. Your musculoskeletal system bears the greatest burden of medieval life. Constant heavy labor from childhood creates premature arthritis, herniated discs, and joints that grind bone on bone after decades of use. Broken bones, if they heal, often do so incorrectly, leaving limbs deformed and less functional. Rickets from vitamin D deficiency curves the bones of many children, creating bow-legged adults who move with permanent discomfort. Women's bodies endure additional trials. Multiple pregnancies without modern medical care leave lasting damage, prolapsed uteruses, chronic incontinence, pelvic floor injuries that never heal properly. Many women die in childbirth, but those who survive often live with internal injuries that receive no treatment beyond rest, which few can afford to take. The medieval body ages prematurely by modern standards. A 40-year-old peasant might physically resemble a modern 70-year-old with similar limitations of movement, chronic pain levels, and vulnerability to disease. Noble bodies fare somewhat better due to better nutrition and less physical labor, but even they suffer from medical issues that would be easily treatable today. Pain is your constant companion. Toothaches, joint inflammation, digestive distress, headaches, eye strain, menstrual cramps. The medieval body is a symphony of discomfort, playing at varying intensities. You manage this pain through a combination of herbal remedies, some slightly effective, others useless. Alcohol, very effective, but with its own problems, and simple endurance. The concept of being truly pain-free might be so foreign to medieval people that they wouldn't even recognize it as a possibility. You're shorter than your modern counterparts, stunted by childhood malnutrition and disease. Adult men might average 5 feet 5 inches to 5 feet 7 inches. Women, several inches less. Your frame is likely wiry rather than plump, unless you're among the nobility. Excess body fat is rare, except among the wealthy who can afford abundant food without corresponding physical labor. The medieval body is not completely without advantages, however. Your immune system, if you've survived childhood, has been battle-tested against a host of pathogens. Your muscles, while often painful, are functionally strong from constant use. Your cardiovascular endurance from a lifetime of walking everywhere would likely put many modern humans to shame. But these advantages come at tremendous cost. The medieval body is used up quickly, exploited for labor until it breaks down, and given minimal maintenance along the way. It exists to work, in fields, workshops, homes, or battlefields, not to be pampered, preserved, or protected. It's a tool, not a temple, and when it breaks beyond repair, it's discarded with ceremony, but little surprise. The toilet situation, a medieval nightmare. Perhaps nothing illustrates the gulf between medieval and modern existence more vividly than how humans dealt with their most basic biological function, waste elimination. The medieval toilet situation would traumatize most modern people accustomed to private, flushable porcelain fixtures and abundant toilet paper. For rural peasants, the toilet was literally anywhere convenient, behind the house, in nearby woods, or in the animal pen where waste would mix with manure for later use as fertilizer. The concept of a designated bathroom didn't exist. You simply found a relatively private spot, squatted, handled your business, and cleaned yourself with whatever was available: leaves, moss, a handful of straw, or smooth stones. The left hand was typically reserved for this cleaning, which is why eating with the left hand was, and in some cultures still is, considered taboo. In winter or during illness, this outdoor arrangement became problematic. The solution was usually a chamber pot, a ceramic or wooden vessel kept under the bed or in a corner, used by all family members and emptied once daily or when full. Imagine the smell of a container of human waste sitting in an enclosed space for hours, adding its unique contribution to the already pungent atmosphere of a medieval home. Urban dwellings sometimes featured more sophisticated arrangements. Wealthier town houses might include a garderobe, essentially a small closet built into an exterior wall with a hole opening directly to the outside. These medieval outhouses dropped everything directly onto the ground below, which might be a moat, a street, or a cesspit. While slightly more convenient, they introduced their own problems. The smell that rose from the pile below, the splashback from longer drops, and the fact that external garderobe chutes advertised to potential thieves exactly where to break in. Public latrines existed in some medieval towns and monasteries. These were less private facilities than social spaces. Imagine a wooden platform built over a flowing stream or pit with multiple holes cut into it. Users would sit shoulder to shoulder, conducting business while potentially engaging in conversation. No dividers, no privacy, just a row of people handling a natural function in full view of one another. These facilities bred disease as effectively as they eliminated waste, becoming vectors for dysentery and other infections. For those without access to even these crude facilities, chamber pots were emptied into streets, often with the warning cry of "Gardez-l'eau," from the French "Gardez l'eau," or "watch the water." This practice turned urban centers into open sewers, with narrow streets channeling a toxic slurry of human and animal waste, food scraps, and whatever else residents discarded. After rainfall, streets literally flowed with this concoction, which might seep into basements or splash onto pedestrians as carts passed through. The wealthy weren't significantly better off despite their privileges. Castle garderobes might drop waste directly into moats, creating defensive barriers that were as olfactory as they were physical. Monastery latrines, often the most advanced of the era, featured stone seats above running water that carried waste away, but still without privacy or effective ventilation. Toilet paper didn't exist until centuries later. The poor used natural materials as mentioned earlier, while the wealthy might use wool or hemp cloth. Historical records mention that in some royal households, a designated servant called a groom of the stool would assist the monarch with post-defecation cleaning, a position that, despite its seemingly undignified nature, was highly coveted because of the private access it provided to the ruler. The practical consequences of this primitive waste management were catastrophic for public health. Human waste contaminated water supplies, creating endless cycles of waterborne disease. Parasitic infections were nearly universal. The constant presence of fecal matter in living environments meant that food was regularly contaminated, perpetuating intestinal illnesses that modern humans rarely experience. Perhaps most striking is the psychological aspect. Medieval people lacked the bathroom privacy that modern individuals take for granted. Elimination was often a semi-public or fully public act, observed by family members or strangers. This created a fundamentally different relationship with bodily functions, a matter-of-fact acceptance that these natural processes were just another aspect of communal life, rather than activities requiring special spaces and privacy. The medieval approach to human waste reflects the era's broader reality. Survival took precedence over comfort, privacy, or hygiene. When daily life is a struggle to simply exist, the niceties of private bathrooms with scented candles become inconceivable luxuries rather than basic expectations. Sustenance and starvation, the fight to feed. The daily bread, medieval diet, and its discontents. Food in the Middle Ages wasn't just different from modern cuisine. It existed in an entirely different relationship with the people who consumed it. The medieval relationship with food was dominated by scarcity, preservation challenges, and stark inequality. Forget farm-to-table restaurants or concerns about gluten sensitivities. Medieval people worried about whether there would be food at all. Bread was the literal and figurative staff of life for medieval Europeans, constituting up to 80% of caloric intake for peasants. But this wasn't the soft, enriched bread of modern supermarkets. Medieval bread was dense, coarse, and often adulterated. Only the wealthy ate white bread made from wheat flour. The majority consumed maslin bread made from mixed grains or dark rye bread that was significantly cheaper. In times of shortage, bread became even more suspect. Millers and bakers stretched flour with all manner of fillers: ground peas, acorns, ferns, straw, sawdust, or even dried and ground clay. These additions provided bulk but minimal nutrition, creating loaves that filled stomachs without nourishing bodies. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and damp conditions, frequently contaminated bread and caused hallucinations, seizures, and gangrene, a condition called Saint Anthony's fire. Anthony's fire that periodically devastated medieval communities. The centerpiece of the peasant diet was pottage, a perpetually simmering pot of whatever was available. Into a cauldron of water went grain, legumes, and whatever vegetables could be grown or foraged. Pottage wasn't a recipe so much as a survival strategy, with new ingredients added as old ones were consumed, creating a pot that might not be completely emptied for weeks. The resulting gruel provided calories and sustained life, but offered limited nutrition and monotonous flavors. Meat was a luxury consumed in quantities directly proportional to social status. Peasants might eat meat a few times a year, typically on major feast days, or when an animal was too old or injured to be productive. Even then, the best cuts went to the Lord as part of tithes or taxes. The poorest made do with offal, organs, entrails, blood, and other parts disdained by the wealthy but containing crucial nutrients. Preservation dominated medieval food preparation out of necessity. Without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly, especially in warmer months. Smoking, drying, salting, pickling, and fermenting were essential techniques that transformed fresh food into storage-stable provisions. These methods dramatically altered flavors and textures while often creating nutritional trade-offs. Salt preservation, for instance, helped prevent protein spoilage, but contributed to hypertension and water retention. The medieval palate accommodated levels of spoilage that would horrify modern diners. Slightly rancid meat, fermented beyond modern preferences and produced past its prime, were normal parts of the diet rather than reasons to discard food. When hunger is a constant companion, food safety standards become remarkably flexible. Seasonality governed diet with an iron hand. Spring often brought the hungry gap when winter stores had dwindled, but new crops weren't yet ready for harvest. During these weeks, meals became increasingly sparse and creative. Hedgerow greens, tree bark, and even boiled leather might appear in the cooking pot as genuine starvation loomed. Summer and fall, by contrast, offered relative abundance, with fresh produce and dairy products supplementing the staple grains. Dairy products were important, but different from their modern counterparts. Milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration, so it was primarily consumed as cheese or butter. These weren't the carefully aged gourmet products of modern cheese boards, but rather functional preservation methods that extended the usability of a valuable protein source. Hard cheeses, in particular, could last months when properly stored, providing crucial protein during winter. Vegetables featured prominently in the peasant diet, but were limited to what could be grown locally. Cabbage, onions, garlic, leeks, and root vegetables like turnips and carrots formed the backbone of medieval produce. Fresh greens were seasonal and often foraged rather than cultivated: dandelion leaves, nettles, and other wild plants that modern eaters would consider weeds. Fruit appeared in season, but couldn't be preserved effectively except through drying or fermenting into alcohol. The medieval meal schedule differed substantially from modern conventions. The primary meal typically came at midday, when daylight allowed for proper food preparation and workers needed maximum energy. Evening meals were lighter, and the modern concept of breakfast varied widely by region and class. Many started their days with nothing more than ale or bread, considering a morning meal either unnecessary or an unaffordable luxury. Cooking technology created its own limitations. The typical peasant home featured a central hearth without chimneys or effective temperature control. Food was boiled in cauldrons, roasted on spits, or baked in communal ovens, often controlled by the local lord and available only on specific days for a fee. These methods created a cuisine dominated by one-pot meals and relatively simple preparations. Baking, in particular, was rarely done at home because few could afford the fuel required to heat an oven properly. Spices weren't entirely absent, but were used drastically differently than in modern cooking. The wealthy displayed their status through imported spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, often used in quantities that would overwhelm modern palates. These weren't just flavoring agents, but status symbols and sometimes medicines. Peasants relied on locally available herbs, mint, thyme, parsley, sage, grown in kitchen gardens or gathered from the wild. Beverages deserve special mention because water was often unsafe to drink due to contamination. Small beer, a low-alcohol brew, and ale were dietary staples consumed by all ages, including children. These weren't primarily intoxicants, but safe hydration sources, as the brewing process killed many pathogens. Wine was common in regions suitable for grape cultivation, while mead, fermented honey, and cider provided alternatives where appropriate. The medieval approach to food was fundamentally pragmatic rather than pleasure-centered. Food was fuel, sustenance, and survival, not primarily entertainment or self-expression. This doesn't mean medieval people didn't enjoy eating or develop sophisticated culinary traditions, especially among the wealthy. But for most, the relationship with food was dominated by concerns about having enough, rather than having the right kind or the most enjoyable variety. This pragmatism extended to waste. There was virtually none. Every edible part of plants and animals was consumed. Stale bread became trenchers, edible plates, or was softened in liquid as sops. Bones were boiled multiple times to extract every calorie before finally being ground into meal for fertilizer. Food scraps went to animals, or the perpetual pottage pot. In a world where starvation loomed constantly, discarding anything edible was inconceivable. When crops failed, the horror of medieval famine. While daily nutrition in medieval Europe was challenging even in good times, periodic famines transformed difficult circumstances into catastrophic humanitarian crises that modern people can barely comprehend. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 provides the most dramatic example, but similar events occurred regularly throughout the medieval period, creating collective trauma that shaped society, religion, and psychology. Unlike modern famines, often caused by political conflict or distribution problems, medieval famines typically began with weather. The medieval warm period gave way to the Little Ice Age around 1300, bringing colder, wetter conditions to much of Europe. The years 1315 to 1317 saw unprecedented rainfall, flooding fields, rotting seeds in the ground, and making harvest impossible in many regions. When this continued for multiple growing seasons, the result was agricultural collapse. The progression of famine followed predictable and horrifying stages. First came rising food prices, as shortages became apparent. Grain costs might increase tenfold or more, placing basic sustenance beyond reach for common people. Families sold possessions, then tools, then land, sacrificing their future productivity for immediate survival. Seed grain, normally preserved for the next planting, was consumed in desperation, ensuring the crisis would continue even if weather improved. As hunger deepened, societies transformed. Theft increased dramatically, with food storage facilities requiring armed guards. Towns closed gates to starving rural migrants. The wealthy barricaded themselves behind walls, while churches opened granaries, but only until their own supplies ran thin. Contemporary chronicles describe crowds fighting over food scraps in marketplace gutters, and children crying continuously from hunger until they became too weak to cry at all. People turned to increasingly desperate food sources. Famine foods, items normally considered inedible or barely nutritious, became dietary staples. Tree bark was stripped and ground into flour. Acorns, normally considered fit only for pigs, became human food. Nettles, thistles, and other plants with minimal calories were gathered and boiled. These survival foods often caused digestive distress, diarrhea, and blocked nutrient absorption, further weakening already compromised bodies. As starvation advanced, psychological changes accompanied physical deterioration. Contemporaries described a madness of hunger, where normal social bonds dissolved. Abandonment became common, The elderly were left to die, so younger family members might survive. Parents abandoned children, or in the most extreme documented cases, consumed them. Court records from various European famines contain horrific accounts of infanticide and cannibalism, not as sensationalized tales, but as criminal proceedings documenting societal breakdown under impossible conditions. Death from starvation follows a predictable, terrible progression. The body first consumes its fat reserves, then begins breaking down muscle for energy. Metabolism slows dramatically. The starving become listless, weak, and cognitively impaired as the brain receives inadequate glucose. The immune system collapses, making any minor infection potentially fatal. In children, this process occurs more rapidly and causes permanent developmental damage in survivors. The visible signs of severe starvation are distinctive and haunting. The belly distends from protein deficiency, while limbs become skeletal. Skin turns paper-thin, tears easily, and loses elasticity. Hair falls out. Open sores develop and don't heal. Medieval chroniclers describe the starving as walking corpses, with eyes like glass, and skin stretched over bones like parchment. Famine brings disease as a loyal companion. Weakened by malnutrition, bodies cannot fight infections. Desperate people consume spoiled food, drink from contaminated sources, and cluster together seeking aid, creating perfect conditions for epidemics. Typhus, spread by lice, dysentery, from contaminated water, and tuberculosis, which accelerates in malnourished hosts, typically accompanied famine, significantly increasing mortality beyond starvation itself. The demographic impacts were catastrophic. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed between 10 to 25% of Europe's population, millions of people. Entire villages were abandoned. Birth rates plummeted as malnourished women stopped menstruating and men became temporarily infertile. Those children conceived during famine often suffered lifelong health problems and cognitive impairments, creating generational damage that persisted long after food supplies returned. Recovery from major famines took decades. Agricultural infrastructure, livestock herds, orchards, properly maintained fields required years to rebuild. Social structures fractured during extreme hunger, healed slowly if at all. The psychological trauma created lasting changes in behavior, particularly around food storage and consumption. Many medieval practices that seem irrational to modern observers, prohibitions against wasting even crumbs, elaborate storage systems, strong food-sharing norms, evolved directly from famine experiences. Medieval religious interpretations of famine added another dimension of suffering. While modern people understand weather patterns and crop failures in scientific terms, medieval Europeans typically viewed famine as divine punishment for collective sin. This created not just physical hunger, but spiritual agony, the belief that your community's moral failings had brought God's wrath upon innocent children. Religious responses included mass processions, increased donations to churches, extreme penances like self-flagellation, and occasionally violence against religious minorities accused of provoking divine anger. What modern observers might find most striking about medieval famine accounts is how they were accepted as recurring, inevitable features of existence, rather than preventable tragedies. Without effective transportation systems, weather forecasting, agricultural science, or coordinated government response, communities could only endure and hope. Each generation experienced at least one significant food shortage, creating a collective memory and expectation that hunger would periodically stalk the land, like an inescapable predator. The psychological shadow of famine loomed over medieval life, even in times of relative plenty. Food security was temporary, provisional, and never guaranteed. The question wasn't if famine would return, but when, and whether your family would survive it. This omnipresent fear helps explain medieval food practices, religious intensity, social structures, and even reproductive patterns in ways that are difficult for people in food-secure societies to fully comprehend. Class on a plate, food, and social hierarchy. While hunger was the great equalizer in times of famine, everyday food consumption in medieval Europe displayed and reinforced rigid social stratification more visibly than perhaps any other aspect of daily life. What you ate, how it was prepared when you consumed it, and in what quantities weren't just matters of taste or nutrition. They were explicit markers of your place in the social order, as clearly defined as clothing or speech. At the top of the food pyramid sat royalty and high nobility, whose tables featured conspicuous abundance and variety that would be recognizable, if somewhat strange, to modern gourmands. A royal feast might present dozens of different dishes, multiple types of meats and fish, elaborately presented in their original forms to display wealth, entire peacocks redressed in their feathers, swans rebuilt after cooking, boars' heads with tusks reinserted. Spices featured prominently in elite cuisine, not just for flavor, but as status symbols. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and saffron were literally worth their weight in gold, transported at great risk along trade routes stretching to Asia. These precious seasonings were used in quantities that would overwhelm modern palates, creating flavor profiles simultaneously sophisticated and unsubtle, the gustatory equivalent of wearing excessive jewelry. The nobility's food wasn't just differently seasoned, but fundamentally different from peasant fare. While common people subsisted primarily on grains, vegetables, and legumes, the aristocratic diet centered on meat and fish. The more varieties and greater quantities, the better. Medieval noble households often consumed dozens of animal species now absent from Western tables. Peacocks, swans, herons, porpoises, and barnacle geese, classified as fish due to medieval zoological theories and thus permissible on fast days. Presentation elevated elite dining to performance art. Food was gilded with actual gold leaf, sculpted into fantastical shapes, or presented as subtleties, elaborate edible tableaux depicting biblical scenes, heraldic beasts, or political statements. These weren't merely decorative, but conveyed messages about wealth, education, and power to dinner guests who could read these culinary symbols. The physical environment of elite dining further reinforced hierarchy. Lords ate on raised daises, sometimes literally above their retainers. They used specialized implements, knives, spoons, and eventually forks, while lesser diners might have only a personal knife or nothing at all. The finest foods were placed nearest to high-status diners, with quality diminishing with social distance from the head table. Below the great nobles, but above common peasants, the gentry and wealthy merchants occupied a middle culinary position. Their tables featured meat more regularly than peasant diets, but in less extravagant variety than the nobility. Spices appeared, but in more modest quantities. Their meals balanced display with pragmatism, often including the same basic ingredients as peasant food, but prepared with more refinement, better quality, and greater abundance. Urban professionals, successful craftspeople, guild masters, and municipal officials ate better than rural peasants, but without the ostentation of the truly wealthy. Their diets benefited from town markets, offering more variety than rural environments, but they remained constrained by seasonal availability and preservation limitations. In many towns, sumptuary laws explicitly restricted who could serve particular foods and in what quantities, making diet a legally enforced class marker. For the vast majority, rural peasants and urban laborers, food was primarily functional rather than pleasurable or symbolic. Their diets centered on grains, primarily rye, barley, and oats rather than wheat, legumes for protein, seasonal vegetables, and small amounts of dairy. Meat appeared rarely, perhaps on major feast days or when an animal was slaughtered because it could no longer work. Fish might supplement protein for those living near water sources, though the best catches were often owed to lords as rent payment. The poorest existed in a state of permanent undernourishment, punctuated by actual hunger. Beggars, day laborers, and the destitute survived on charity, gleaning, collecting leftover grain after harvest, and foods considered barely suitable for human consumption. Spoiled grains, food waste from noble kitchens, and items like thistles or nettles that required careful preparation to be remotely palatable. Religious institutions maintained their own food hierarchies. Monastery kitchens prepared different meals for the abbot, ordinary monks, lay workers, and the poor receiving charity. While monastic rules often emphasized simplicity, many religious houses developed sophisticated culinary traditions within technical compliance of their order's regulations. Benedictine monasteries became known for excellence in cheese-making, brewing, and wine production, ostensibly for medicinal purposes or income generation, but conveniently enhancing the brothers' dining experience. The medieval church, imposed fasting rules that affected all social classes, but were experienced very differently depending on wealth. Fast days, potentially 150 to 180 days of the year, including Lent, Advent, and various saints' days, prohibited meat, and sometimes dairy and eggs as well. For the poor, whose diets contained minimal animal products anyway, this meant little practical change. For the wealthy, it created a separate elite cuisine based on fish and seafood, with ingenious workarounds like beaver tail, classified as fish because beavers swim, and elaborate almond milk substitutes for dairy. Special occasions temporarily modified but rarely erased these distinctions. Religious festivals might allow peasants brief access to better food, but even these celebrations reinforced hierarchy. Christmas feasts in great houses included token gifts of food to tenants and servants, simultaneously demonstrating noblesse oblige and reinforcing dependence. Harvest festivals might allow greater consumption, but reminded participants that the Lord claimed first share of all production. Food functioned as both reward and punishment within the medieval social system. Lords provided food as payment for service, with quality and quantity precisely calibrated to status. Judicial penalties often included food restrictions or requirements. Prisoners might receive bread and water only, while penance could include fasting or consuming specific foods associated with humility. Even the physical arrangement of medieval agriculture reflected and reinforced this hierarchy. The best land nearest to villages was typically reserved for the lord's domain. Peasant plots occupied less favorable terrain, with the poorest farmers relegated to marginal lands requiring most labor for least return. Wild food sources followed similar patterns. The best hunting grounds were closed to commoners as exclusive noble preserves, with poaching punishable by mutilation or death. Perhaps most striking to modern observers would be how explicitly and unabashedly these distinctions were displayed and accepted. The idea that everyone deserves similar quality food would have seemed not just unrealistic, but conceptually alien to medieval thinkers. Food hierarchy wasn't just an economic reality, but a cosmological principle, a reflection of divine order where each person had their proper place and consumption appropriate to their station. This rigid stratification makes modern food democracy, where billionaires and minimum wage workers might eat identical fast food burgers, seem revolutionary by comparison. In medieval Europe, you truly were what you ate, and what you ate was determined by who you were in ways that defined your entire existence. Toil until death, medieval work and punishment. Labor without end, the medieval workday. The modern concept of work, with its regulated hours, safety standards, vacations, and retirement, would be completely unrecognizable to medieval people. Their relationship with labor was fundamentally different, encompassing not just how they spent their days, but defining their entire identity and worth within society. Work wasn't something you did, it was who you were. For the vast majority of medieval Europeans, up to 90% of the population at various times, agricultural labor dominated existence. The peasant's workday wasn't measured in hours, but by daylight. You began working when light permitted and continued until darkness made it impossible, with brief breaks for meals. During summer, this could mean 16-hour workdays. Winter brought shorter labor, but introduced its own challenges of cold, wet conditions and the struggle to maintain animals with limited fodder. The agricultural calendar dictated life's rhythm with absolute authority. Spring brought the exhausting work of plowing and planting, often done by hand or with rudimentary plows pulled by underfed oxen or horses. Summer required constant weeding, irrigation, and protection of crops from animals and thieves. Harvest season demanded the most intense labor of all, with every able body working frantically to collect crops before weather could destroy them. Winter, contrary to popular imagination, wasn't a time of rest, but of repair, indoor work, caring for livestock, and preparing for the next growing season. This work wasn't just exhausting, but dangerous. Plows could hit unexpected obstacles and break ribs or limbs. Scythes and sickles claimed fingers and created wounds that easily became infected. Working with large animals led to trampling and crushing injuries. Falls from haystacks, trees, or buildings were common and often fatal or permanently disabling. There was no workers' compensation, no disability insurance, no sick leave. An injury that prevented work meant immediate economic crisis for your entire family. The physical toll of agricultural labor was visible on medieval bodies. Skeletal remains show distinctive patterns of wear, vertebrae compressed from carrying heavy loads, shoulders and hips deformed from repetitive movements, teeth ground down from using them as tools. By 30, most peasants exhibited joint damage equivalent to modern people decades older. By 50, if they reached it, many were effectively disabled by the accumulated damage of decades in the fields. Urban crafts and trades offered different work patterns, but equal intensity. Guild regulations often specified working hours from dawn to dusk, with apprentices and journeymen laboring under the constant supervision of masters. Craftsmanship required immense precision, achieved through years of repetitive practice. Not the romanticized creative expression often imagined by modern enthusiasts, but strict adherence to established techniques under threat of punishment for deviation. Many urban occupations created specific occupational hazards. Blacksmiths developed distinctive muscular hypertrophy in their dominant arms, while suffering respiratory damage from coal smoke and metal particles. Tanners' skin turned yellow from constant exposure to chemicals used to process leather, and many went deaf from the constant pounding required to soften hides. Miners rarely lived past 30, their lungs destroyed by dust and their bodies broken by accidents. Textile workers developed spinal deformities from hunching over looms and often went blind from eye strain and poor lighting. Medieval labor lacked even the most basic safety considerations. Scaffolding for construction was made from whatever wood was available, secured with rope, and frequently collapsed. Protective equipment was virtually non-existent. No hard hats, no safety goggles, no steel-toed boots. Workers handled toxic substances like lead, mercury, and arsenic with bare hands, breathing their fumes directly and often consuming them accidentally through contaminated food and hands. The concept of occupational safety simply didn't exist. Risk was an accepted part of work rather than something to be mitigated. Children entered the workforce astonishingly early by modern standards. By age 7, most were performing meaningful economic contributions, gathering firewood, scaring birds from fields, watching younger siblings to free adult labor, or beginning apprenticeships. By their early teens, children worked adult schedules while still growing, their developing bodies permanently shaped by labor demands. This wasn't considered exploitation, but necessary preparation for survival. For women, work never ceased. In addition to agricultural labor alongside men, they maintained households, prepared food, produced textiles, cared for children, and tended small livestock. While men might find occasional rest during seasonal downturns, women's domestic labor remained constant year-round, from dawn until well after dark. Medieval records and folklore acknowledge this disparity. Stories often portray women rising before husbands and sleeping after them, maintaining household function with minimal recognition or relief. Medieval workers didn't experience the modern separation between work and home. For most, the household was the workplace. Fields surrounded the dwelling, crafts were practiced in or adjacent to living spaces, mercantile goods might be stored where families slept. This integration meant work was never truly left at the office. It remained physically and psychologically present at all times, with no distinct boundary between labor and personal life. The concept of retirement didn't exist for ordinary people. You worked until you physically couldn't, at which point you became dependent on children or community charity if available. Many elderly continued contributing through less physically demanding tasks like childcare, food processing, or repair work until their final days. The inability to work often meant social death before physical death, as your value to the community diminished with your productivity. Payment for labor took various forms beyond modern currency wages. Peasants typically worked land in exchange for giving portions of their produce to lords, ranging from 10% to 50%, depending on region and historical period. Craftspeople might be paid in kind, goods or services exchanged directly for their products. Even when currency changed hands, wages were often supplemented with food, lodging, or other necessities, creating complex economic relationships beyond simple employment. Medieval workers experienced almost no upward mobility as we understand it today. Peasants remained peasants across generations, despite occasional exceptional cases. Apprentices might become journeymen, and eventually masters, but the number of master positions was strictly limited by guilds. The modern concept of meritocracy, advancement based primarily on ability and effort, would have seemed nonsensical in a world where birth status, guild membership, gender, and personal connections determined economic opportunities far more than individual talent. Labor wasn't just physically demanding, but psychologically punishing. Work was performed under constant surveillance. Lords or their representatives monitored peasant labor. Guild masters scrutinized apprentices. Neighbors observed each other's work habits. Slacking could result not just in economic penalties, but public humiliation, physical punishment, or exclusion from community support systems crucial for survival. The medieval approach to labor created people with skills modern workers would find astonishing. The ability to thatch a roof, butcher an animal, preserve food for winter, build furnishings from raw lumber, maintain complex irrigation systems, and produce textiles from sheep to finished garment. This self-sufficiency came at tremendous cost, however: shortened lives, chronic pain, minimal leisure, and acceptance of suffering as the natural condition of existence. Perhaps most foreign to modern sensibilities was the medieval internalization of work as moral and spiritual identity. Labor wasn't considered an unfortunate necessity or a means to an end, but an inherent good, divine punishment for original sin that simultaneously offered opportunity for spiritual redemption. Idleness wasn't just economically problematic, but morally suspect. The medieval worker didn't labor simply to live, but lived to labor, finding meaning and virtue in work itself, regardless of its conditions or compensation. This philosophy created a population uniquely adapted to hardship, capable of productivity under conditions modern workers would consider impossible. It also enabled exploitation on a scale difficult to comprehend from our perspective, where exhaustion, injury, and premature death weren't workplace failures, but accepted costs of human economic activity. Justice and cruelty, medieval punishment as public spectacle. If medieval work could be brutal, the punishment system that maintained social order elevated brutality to public performance art. Justice in the Middle Ages wasn't primarily focused on rehabilitation or even fair retribution. It centered on creating spectacular displays of authority that would terrify potential wrongdoers while reinforcing social hierarchy through physical suffering. Medieval justice operated on fundamentally different principles than modern legal systems. Guilt wasn't determined primarily through evidence as we understand it, but through community reputation, social standing, and often bizarre tests of divine judgment. The concept of innocent until proven guilty would have seemed absurd to medieval legal authorities, who operated on the assumption that accusation usually indicated guilt, requiring disproof rather than proof. For serious accusations, trial by ordeal remained common in early medieval periods. These trials took various forms, all assuming God would protect the innocent through miraculous intervention. The accused might be required to carry a red-hot iron several paces. If the burns healed cleanly within 3 days, they were innocent. If infection set in, as it almost invariably did, their guilt was confirmed. Alternatively, they might be bound and thrown into water. Floating indicated guilt, as water rejected the impure, while sinking suggested innocence, though the proven innocent often drowned before they could be retrieved. As medieval legal systems evolved, these supernatural determinations gave way to more systematic approaches, though not necessarily more just ones. Trial by combat allowed accused and accuser, or their champions, to battle, assuming God would strengthen the righteous party. This obviously favored the wealthy who could hire skilled fighters, the physically strong, and men over women, though some jurisdictions allowed women to fight men with handicaps like the man standing in a pit. Torture formed a standard, accepted part of the judicial process, not as punishment, but as investigative technique. The assumption that physical suffering would reveal truth led to elaborate systems of questioning that effectively guaranteed confessions, guilty or not. Implements like the strapado, which dislocated shoulders by hanging victims by their bound wrists, the rack, which stretched bodies until joints separated, or simpler techniques like crushing thumbs in specialized vices extracted admissions that courts accepted as definitive proof regardless of subsequent retractions. Once guilt was established, punishment followed with theatrical cruelty designed for maximum public impact. Execution methods were carefully calibrated to the crime and the criminal's social status, creating a hierarchy of suffering that reflected and reinforced social stratification. Hanging, the most common execution method for common criminals, wasn't the relatively quick process of later periods with calculated drops to break necks. Medieval hanging involved slow strangulation, as the victim was hoisted up, their legs kicking and body twisting for minutes or even longer before death. Families sometimes pulled on the dangling legs to hasten death as an act of mercy. The corpse would remain displayed until decomposition advanced significantly, serving as a warning and reminder. Beheading was reserved for nobles and considered more honorable, though its implementation varied dramatically in competence and outcome. A skilled executioner with a sharp sword or axe might sever the head in a single stroke. More commonly, multiple blows were required, with some historical accounts documenting up to 11 strokes needed to complete a beheading, with the victim conscious for many of them. Burning alive, primarily used for heretics, witches, and sometimes sexual offenders, represented one of the most excruciating execution methods. Contrary to popular imagination, victims didn't typically die quickly in a blaze, but were positioned above slow-burning fires that gradually roasted them over extended periods. Occasionally, executioners showed mercy by strangling victims before flames reached them, or placing gunpowder packs around their necks to hasten death. But these kindnesses were far from universal. Drawing and quartering, reserved for treason, represented the pinnacle of judicial cruelty. The condemned was dragged through streets behind a horse, the drawing, hanged until nearly dead, revived, emasculated, eviscerated, with organs burned before their still-living eyes, beheaded, and their body divided into 4 parts, quartering, for display in different locations. Each step was calculated for maximum pain and public spectacle, with crowds frequently numbering in the thousands for high-profile executions. Beyond execution, corporal punishments for lesser crimes created permanent, visible markers of criminality. Thieves lost hands, perjurers had tongues partially removed, sexual offenders might be castrated, and forgers could lose fingers essential to their craft. These mutilations served dual purposes. They physically prevented repeat offenses, while permanently marking the criminal for community identification. Public humiliation supplemented physical punishment through devices like the pillory, which locked head and hands in a wooden frame for hours or days, exposing the offender to verbal abuse, thrown objects, and potentially lethal weather exposure. Or the cucking stool, which repeatedly dunked women deemed quarrelsome or disorderly in water, risking drowning and hypothermia. What modern observers might find most disturbing about this system wasn't just its cruelty, but its performative, festive nature. Executions were scheduled for market days to ensure maximum attendance. Vendors sold food and drink to spectators who might travel considerable distances for particularly noteworthy displays. Children were brought specifically to witness punishments as educational experiences. Execution sites became standard features of urban geography, with permanent gallows, gibbets for displaying bodies, and execution grounds familiar to all residents. The spectators weren't passive observers, but active participants in judicial violence. They might throw objects at the condemned, shout abuse, or in some cases be invited to participate directly in the punishment. When witches were burned in some jurisdictions, audience members added fuel to the fire, making the entire community complicit in the execution rather than merely witnessing it. Medieval justice displayed stark disparities based on social status. Nobility often received preferential treatment, private executions, quicker methods, or the opportunity to pay fines instead of suffering physical punishment. Some regions formalized this inequality through explicit price lists, specifying different penalties for identical crimes based on the perpetrators' and victims' social ranks. Harming a noble might cost 10 times the fine of injuring a peasant, while a noble who harmed a peasant might pay a fraction of what a common-born person would for the same offense. Religious authorities maintained parallel justice systems with their own peculiar features. Ecclesiastical courts could not technically execute offenders, maintaining the principle that the church abhors blood. This technical limitation led to the practice of relaxing condemned heretics to secular authorities with the understanding they would be executed, allowing the church to maintain theoretical distance from the killing while effectively ensuring it happened. The Inquisition, contrary to popular misconception, rarely conducted executions itself, but created elaborate investigative and trial procedures that identified heretics for secular punishment. Its methodical approach to extracting confessions through psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, and selective physical tortures set new standards for systematic judicial cruelty that secular courts often emulated. Prison, the centerpiece of modern punishment systems, played a minimal role in medieval justice. Jails existed primarily to hold the accused before trial or the condemned before execution, rather than as punishment themselves. Conditions in these holding facilities were abysmal. Dark, filthy, unheated spaces where prisoners depended on family or charity for food and often died from disease before their cases were resolved. Some offenses could be resolved through financial compensation rather than physical punishment, but this system heavily favored the wealthy. Vergeld, literally man payment, specified the monetary value of injuries or deaths based on the victim's social status, allowing those with sufficient resources to literally get away with murder by paying the prescribed amount to the victim's family. This entire system operated without the professional safeguards modern people take for granted. There were no police forces as we understand them, no forensic science beyond the most rudimentary observation, no DNA testing or fingerprinting, no standardized investigation procedures. Accusations often came from neighbors or personal enemies. Evidence was primarily testimonial, and officials had strong incentives to find someone guilty once accusations were made, regardless of actual culpability. The psychological impact of this justice system extended far beyond those directly punished. Medieval communities lived with constant awareness that minor infractions, or even false accusations, could lead to mutilation or death, creating a culture of surveillance where neighbors monitored each other's behavior and conformity became a survival strategy. The public nature of punishment meant that even children witnessed extreme violence regularly, normalizing cruelty and suffering as inherent features of social order. Medieval justice wasn't completely without mercy or procedural protections. Church sanctuary could temporarily shield accused persons. Appeal systems existed in some jurisdictions. Character witnesses could influence outcomes. Some regions developed increasingly sophisticated legal codes with greater procedural regularity, but these safeguards existed within a system fundamentally oriented toward demonstration of authority through suffering rather than proportional or rehabilitative justice. The medieval approach to crime and punishment reflected broader societal values around authority, physical suffering, and social hierarchy. Pain wasn't incidental to justice, but its central feature. Visible suffering demonstrated the power of authorities, satisfied community demands for retribution, and supposedly deterred future offenses. The body itself became the primary site of judicial action, with permanent marking, dismemberment, and spectacular destruction serving as both punishment and ongoing warning to potential wrongdoers. This system created a society with different psychological relationships to violence, authority, and justice than modern people typically possess. Medieval Europeans didn't just tolerate judicial cruelty, many actively participated in and celebrated it, finding meaning and reinforcement of social order in displays most modern people would consider traumatizing or morally abhorrent. This wasn't because medieval people were inherently more cruel or bloodthirsty, but because their entire conceptual framework around justice, punishment, and the human body operated from fundamentally different premises than our own. Medieval relationships: love, marriage, and family bonds. The romantic medieval marriage you've seen in films, knights pledging undying love to fair maidens, elaborate courtship rituals, passionate declarations beneath castle balconies, is perhaps the most ridiculous fiction ever created about the Middle Ages. The reality of medieval relationships would horrify modern romantics and traumatize contemporary family therapists. Prepare yourself for a journey into romantic arrangements where affection was optional, childhood was brutal by design, and family bonds were primarily economic contracts written in blood, suffering, and obligation. Marriage, the medieval business transaction. In medieval Europe, marriage wasn't primarily about love, it was about land, livestock, political alliances, and the strategic transfer of wealth between families. The concept of marrying for personal happiness would have seemed as bizarre to medieval people as arranged marriages seem to most Westerners today. Marriage was far too important an economic and social institution to leave to something as unreliable as romantic feeling. For peasants, marriage represented a crucial economic partnership necessary for survival. You didn't need a lover, you needed someone who could perform complementary labor. Men required women who could transform raw agricultural products into usable goods, brewing ale, baking bread, spinning wool, preserving meat. Women needed men with access to land and the physical strength for certain agricultural tasks. The medieval peasant wedding wasn't celebrating the union of soulmates, but the formation of a survival-optimized work unit. For nobility, marriages were explicitly political and economic alliances between families. Children, particularly girls, were betrothed as young as 2 or 3 years old, with marriages often consummated when girls reached 12 or 13, regardless of their physical or emotional readiness. Monarchs used their children as diplomatic poker chips, sending young daughters to foreign courts to seal treaties with their bodies and bloodlines. Personal compatibility wasn't merely secondary, it was largely irrelevant. The church technically required consent from both parties for a marriage to be valid, but this consent existed within a system of overwhelming family pressure, economic necessity, and often outright violence. Daughters who refused advantageous matches might be beaten, imprisoned in convents, or disinherited. Sons had marginally more autonomy, but still faced exile or disinheritance if they rejected strategically important marriages. Courtship, as we understand it, barely existed. Particularly among the nobility, many couples met for the first time at their wedding ceremonies. Prior interactions were handled entirely through male relatives and legal proxies negotiating dowries, property transfers, and marriage contracts with the clinical precision of modern corporate mergers. Love wasn't expected to precede marriage, but might, with luck, develop afterward, a pleasant bonus rather than a prerequisite. The medieval wedding ceremony itself would be unrecognizable to modern observers. For most of the medieval period, church weddings weren't required. A simple declaration of intent between parties, witnessed by others, constituted a binding marriage. The ceremony often took place not inside churches, but at church doors, followed by a nuptial mass inside. The white wedding dress, diamond rings, and elaborate receptions are all post-medieval innovations. After the ceremony came the bedding ritual, where the couple was escorted to their marriage bed by rowdy guests who would often stay to witness the consummation or at least verify the sheets the next morning for proof of the bride's virginity. This wasn't considered a shocking invasion of privacy, but a necessary public verification of the marriage's validity and the bride's purported sexual status, the medieval equivalent of a contractual compliance check. Sexual compatibility was not a consideration. The medieval church taught that sexual pleasure, particularly female pleasure, was suspicious at best and sinful at worst. Sex existed primarily for procreation, with church authorities specifying acceptable positions, missionary only, timing, not on church feast days, which numbered over 100 annually, and intent, focused on conception rather than enjoyment. Though these rules were certainly broken, they nonetheless shaped the psychological landscape of marital intimacy. Divorce, as we understand it, didn't exist. Marriage was a sacrament and theoretically indissoluble. Annulments were possible, but typically accessible only to the wealthy who could afford to petition Rome with claims of pre-existing impediments like consanguinity being too closely related. Most unhappy medieval couples remained legally bound until death, though informal separations occurred when situations became unbearable. Despite this pragmatic approach to matrimony, romantic love wasn't unknown in medieval Europe. It simply existed in a separate category from marriage. Courtly love traditions celebrated passionate, often unconsummated devotion between knights and noble ladies, usually someone else's wife. This tradition formed the basis for much medieval literature and music, but operated as emotional fantasy, largely disconnected from the practical business of actual marriages. For most medieval people, a successful marriage had nothing to do with romantic fulfillment or personal growth. A good marriage produced children, preferably sons, increased family prosperity, created useful alliances, and paired two people who could at minimum tolerate each other while effectively managing a household. By these standards, many arranged marriages succeeded admirably. though at a psychological cost modern people would find difficult to comprehend. Medieval parenting, raising children through calculated cruelty. If medieval marriage lacked romance, medieval parenting lacked nearly everything modern people associate with raising children. The brutal pragmatism that characterized all medieval relationships reached its zenith in parent-child dynamics, creating childhood experiences that by contemporary standards would constitute systematic abuse, but were then considered essential training for survival. The medieval approach to children differed fundamentally from modern conceptions. Children weren't viewed as innocent beings requiring protection and nurturing, but as miniature adults corrupted by original sin and requiring strict discipline to develop properly. They weren't cherished for their unique qualities, but valued for their future economic contributions and role in family continuity. This perspective created child-rearing practices focused on immediate utility rather than long-term emotional well-being. Physical discipline wasn't just common, but universally endorsed by religious and secular authorities as essential to proper development. Medieval child-rearing manuals explicitly recommended regular beatings to break children's will and instill obedience. These weren't gentle taps, but substantial blows with rods, switches, or specialized implements. Such treatment wasn't considered abuse, but necessary spiritual and practical training, the medieval equivalent of educational investment. The concept of age-appropriate activities barely existed. By age 7, most children performed meaningful labor, gathering firewood, scaring birds from crops, tending younger siblings, or beginning apprenticeships. By their early teens, children worked adult schedules while still growing, their developing bodies permanently shaped by labor demands. This wasn't considered exploitation, but necessary preparation for survival. Emotional attachment between parents and children was complicated by devastating infant mortality rates. In some periods and regions, up to 30% of infants died before their first birthday, and nearly half of all children died before age 5. This grim reality created psychological defense mechanisms that modern observers might perceive as callousness. Many parents avoided naming children until they demonstrated some likelihood of survival, referring to newborns simply as it, or the infant. When children fell ill, as they frequently did, medical responses ranged from ineffective to actively harmful. Treatments included bloodletting, even for infants, purgatives that caused dehydration, and protective amulets containing toxic substances like mercury. Parents watched helplessly as children suffered through now preventable diseases, often losing multiple offspring to the same infections over years, creating a relationship with childhood illness fundamentally different from modern experiences. Educational approaches reflected the same harsh pragmatism. Literacy was considered unnecessary for most children, particularly girls. Learning occurred primarily through direct observation and incremental participation in adult activities rather than formal instruction. When schooling did occur, rote memorization enforced through physical punishment formed the core methodology, with students routinely beaten for inadequate performance or minor infractions like speaking their native language instead of Latin. The conceit of childhood as a protected time for play, exploration, and gradual maturation simply didn't exist. Children witnessed animal slaughter, human punishment, public executions, and death from their earliest years. Sexual activity wasn't hidden from children in one-room dwellings, where entire families slept together. These exposures weren't considered traumatic, but normal preparation for the realities of medieval existence. Noble families practiced forms of outsourcing parental duties that would shock modern sensibilities. Infants were routinely sent to wet nurses, often peasant women who had recently given birth, regardless of the higher mortality rates associated with this practice. Around age 7, many noble children left home entirely to serve in other households as pages or ladies-in-waiting. Their upbringing delegated to relative strangers to forge useful connections and prevent the softening influence of parental affection. The physical development of medieval children reflected their harsh circumstances. Skeletal remains show evidence of nutritional deficiencies, stunted growth, and premature arthritis from heavy labor. Dental studies reveal enamel hypoplasia, developmental defects caused by severe physiological stress, and advanced decay. By their teens, most medieval children already exhibited physical damage that would affect them for their remaining, typically short, lives. This isn't to suggest medieval parents didn't love their children. Contemporary sources show evidence of genuine affection, grief at children's deaths, and concern for their welfare. However, this love operated within a conceptual framework utterly foreign to modern parenting psychology, one where immediate survival and spiritual salvation took precedence over comfort, happiness, or self-actualization. The medieval parent prepared children not for success or fulfillment, but for endurance, creating human beings capable of withstanding hardship, accepting suffering as normal, and fulfilling their predetermined social and economic roles without question. By those standards, medieval parenting succeeded, producing generations adapted to conditions most modern humans could scarcely survive. The cost in physical and psychological trauma, however, remains incalculable. Family life, crowded, communal, and hierarchical. The physical space of medieval family life bears no resemblance to the private, room-filled homes of modern domestic arrangements. For most people, family life unfolded in a single-room dwelling where privacy didn't exist, hierarchy was strictly enforced, and multiple generations shared space with livestock, vermin, and whatever cottage industry provided supplementary income. The medieval family unit wasn't limited to parents and children, but commonly included grandparents, unmarried siblings, occasionally more distant relatives, and sometimes unrelated workers or apprentices. This extended household functioned as an economic collective, where each member, regardless of age, contributed labor essential to group survival. Within this crowded environment, rigid hierarchies governed interactions. The male head of household held nearly absolute authority, physically enforced when necessary. Women, while essential to household function, remained legally subordinate, with limited property rights and recourse against abuse. Children occupied the bottom tier, expected to show immediate obedience to all adults. These power structures weren't subtle or disguised, but explicitly acknowledged and maintained through both custom and violence. Physical intimacy in medieval households operated under constraints modern couples would find intolerable. Sexual relations occurred in shared sleeping spaces, with minimal privacy beyond perhaps a curtain or facing away from others. Couples developed systems of subtle signals and opportunities, utilizing times when others worked outdoors or attended church functions. Marital sex wasn't considered a private matter between spouses, but a semi-public act subject to community and religious oversight. Medieval families didn't separate work and home life. The household was the primary economic unit of production. Family members worked together, processing agricultural products, creating textiles, preserving food, and maintaining equipment. Children learned their future occupations not through formal education, but by progressive participation in family labor, beginning with simple tasks and advancing to more complex responsibilities as they grew. Meals weren't the conversational family gatherings of modern imagination, but functional refueling organized by strict hierarchy. The male head of household received the best portions and ate first, followed by other men, then women, and finally, children. In particularly poor families during hard times, men might eat while women and children watched, receiving only leftovers, a practical acknowledgement that the primary laborers required sustenance first for the family to survive. Recreation and leisure took fundamentally different forms than in contemporary families. There were no family game nights, movie viewings, or planned activities for children's enrichment. Entertainment centered around religious festivals, communal celebrations tied to agricultural cycles, storytelling, and occasional music. Within the home, leisure often combined with productivity, singing while spinning wool, telling stories during mending sessions, or wood carving during winter evenings. Dispute resolution within families rarely involved negotiation, compromise, or concern for emotional wellness. The patriarch's word was final, with physical enforcement considered appropriate and necessary. A husband beating his wife wasn't generally cause for community intervention unless it prevented her from fulfilling her economic duties or threatened her life. Children had no recourse against parental violence of almost any degree, with community standards intervening only in cases of potential fatality. The medieval family's primary function wasn't emotional fulfillment or personal development, but collective survival. Bonds between members were forged through shared labor, common struggle against external threats, and mutual dependence rather than chosen affinity or personal compatibility. This created family relationships fundamentally different from modern expectations, stronger in some ways, enduring tremendous hardship together, but harsher in others, sacrificing individual needs without hesitation when group survival required it. Intergenerational relationships carried different expectations than in modern families. The elderly weren't segregated into retirement communities, but remained integrated in households, contributing according to their abilities, minding children, performing lighter tasks, and sharing accumulated knowledge. However, this integration wasn't necessarily gentle or respectful. Once seniors could no longer contribute meaningfully, their status declined precipitously, with some effectively reduced to tolerated burdens allocated minimal resources. Death constantly reshaped medieval family configurations, creating complex blended households centuries before the term existed. With high mortality rates for all ages and both sexes, remarriage was common and necessary. Children often had step-parents, half-siblings, and complex relationships with relatives who absorbed orphaned family members. These reconfigured families weren't understood through the psychological lens of modern blended families, but as practical economic realignments necessary for survival. What emerges from this examination isn't a simpler or more natural family structure than modern arrangements, but an equally complicated system adapted to radically different physical, economic, and social conditions. Medieval families weren't more dysfunctional than modern ones. They functioned precisely as required for their environment. The difference lies in what that environment demanded: physical survival and social conformity above individual fulfillment or psychological well-being. Gender relations, brutal enforcement of cosmic order. Medieval gender relations operated from premises modern people would find not merely outdated, but incomprehensibly alien. Gender wasn't understood as a social construct or spectrum of expression, but as an immutable cosmic reality reflecting divine order. The hierarchical relationship between men and women wasn't just social convention, but religious truth, with male dominance established by scriptural authority and reinforced through economic structures, legal systems, and physical violence. The medieval understanding of gender began with medical theories inherited from classical authors like Galen and Aristotle, who viewed women as literally incomplete or imperfect men. Female anatomy was understood as an inverted, internalized version of male organs. The womb a stunted penis, ovaries malformed testicles. This wasn't just anatomical curiosity, but fundamental evidence of women's inferiority, their bodies demonstrating their secondary status in the great chain of being. This biological framework extended to humoral theory, which attributed different temperaments to the sexes. Men, associated with heat and dryness, were considered rational, strong, and naturally dominant. Women, linked to cold and wetness, were deemed emotionally unstable, physically weaker, and requiring male guidance. These weren't seen as stereotypes, but scientific facts about inherent nature, providing justification for rigid gender roles and male authority. Religious teachings reinforced these natural distinctions. Eve's creation from Adam's rib and her role in humanity's fall provided scriptural basis for female subordination. Church fathers extensively documented women's supposedly inherent moral weakness, greater susceptibility to demonic influence, and duty of obedience to male authority. While the Virgin Mary offered a feminine ideal, her veneration emphasized qualities, virginity, silence, obedience, that reinforced rather than challenged patriarchal control. Legal systems codified these beliefs into systematic female disempowerment. Women generally couldn't own property independently, appear in court without male representation, or exercise political rights. Their legal status transferred from father to husband, rendering them perpetual dependents rather than autonomous persons. Violence against wives was legally sanctioned as necessary discipline, with courts intervening only in cases of excessive injury or death. Economic structures further cemented gender hierarchy. Women's work, while essential to medieval subsistence, was systematically undervalued compared to male labor. Female-dominated industries like textile production, food processing, and brewing initially offered some economic independence, but were gradually masculinized as they became more profitable, pushing women into lower status, lower paid roles. The The resulting economic dependence reinforced women's subordination across all social classes. Sexual double standards permeated medieval society. Female virginity was a marketable commodity, with families investing considerable resources protecting daughters' honor, while sons faced minimal sexual restrictions. Once married, women's sexuality remained tightly controlled, while male extramarital activity received tacit acceptance. Wives could be repudiated or punished for adultery that, committed by husbands, warranted no particular comment. Physical enforcement of gender hierarchy was both normalized and institutionalized. Instruments like the scold's bridle, a metal cage locked over a woman's head with a piece inserted into her mouth to prevent speech, or the ducking stool, which repeatedly submerged difficult women underwater, functioned as community-sanctioned technologies for controlling female behavior. Less formal, but equally effective, were the routine beatings administered by fathers and husbands, understood as necessary correction rather than abuse. Women's bodies faced additional gender-specific perils. Childbirth without effective pain management, sterile procedures, or emergency interventions claimed between 1 to 5% of mothers per delivery. Since a woman might experience a dozen or more pregnancies during her reproductive years, maternal mortality approached 25% in some regions, a gender-specific risk that fundamentally shaped female experience. Surviving mothers often suffered permanent injuries, including fistulas, prolapse, and chronic incontinence that received minimal medical attention. Despite this systematic oppression, medieval women weren't entirely without agency or influence. They developed strategies for navigating their restricted circumstances, from subtle domestic power to religious authority as mystics and abbesses. Widowhood, in particular, could offer unprecedented independence, with some widows running businesses, managing property, and making autonomous decisions unavailable to them while married. Guild records, court documents, and literary sources reveal women who defied restrictions, sometimes at tremendous cost. Female brewers who maintained control of their industry despite masculinization attempts. Women who disguised themselves as men to access forbidden opportunities. Mystics like Hildegard of Bingen who leveraged religious authority to speak with unprecedented female boldness. The exceptions highlight the rule's brutality while demonstrating that human agency persists, even under extreme constraint. The medieval gender system's rigidity varied somewhat by region, period, and social class. Peasant women typically performed field labor alongside men during critical seasons, temporarily blurring strict divisions of labor. Urban women in certain regions gained limited property rights through guild membership or specific legal codes. Noble women occasionally exercised significant political power as regents or estate managers, though always within patriarchal frameworks that treated such roles as exceptional rather than normative. What remains most alien to modern sensibilities isn't that medieval society was patriarchal. Many contemporary societies maintain significant gender inequality, but how thoroughly this hierarchy was integrated into medieval cosmology, medicine, theology, and daily practice. Gender wasn't one aspect of identity, but a fundamental organizing principle of existence, believed to reflect divine intention and natural law rather than social convention. Challenging gender roles meant challenging the entire medieval understanding of the universe and humanity's place within it. This comprehensive integration made gender relations remarkably resistant to change, with fundamental structures persisting across centuries despite localized variations. The medieval gender system wasn't a primitive version of modern arrangements, but an entirely different conceptual framework, one that shaped every aspect of relations between men and women, from cosmic understanding to the most intimate physical interactions. Sexual life, church rules, and earthly realities. Medieval sexuality existed in constant tension between ecclesiastical ideals and practical realities. The Church established an elaborate regulatory framework governing every aspect of sexual behavior, who could engage in it, when, how, and for what purpose, while ordinary people navigated these restrictions with varying degrees of compliance, evasion, and rationalization. The ideal medieval sexual arrangement, according to church teaching, was simple: complete abstinence. Virginity represented the highest spiritual state, with marriage a distant second-best option for those too weak to resist carnal urges. Even within marriage, sex existed solely for procreation, with pleasure, especially female pleasure, considered spiritually suspect. These teachings created a fundamental paradox, where an act necessary for human continuation was simultaneously treated as inherently sinful. Sexual regulations extended far beyond basic prohibitions against adultery or fornication into minutely detailed restrictions. Church penitentials, manuals for confessors, specified penances for an astonishing array of sexual sins. From specific positions, anything besides missionary might require weeks of fasting, to timing, sex was forbidden on Sundays, feast days during menstruation, pregnancy, or lactation, to mental state. Thinking about another person during marital relations constituted a form of adultery. The medieval calendar created substantial challenges for compliant couples. Between Sundays, saints' days, Lent, Advent, and other prohibited periods, sexual relations were technically forbidden for nearly half the year. These restrictions applied to married couples, not just unmarried persons, creating the remarkable situation where husbands and wives could be required to perform penance for having relations at the wrong time. Same-sex relations faced particularly harsh condemnation and punishment. While modern conceptions of sexual orientation didn't exist, same-sex acts were categorized among the most serious sexual sins, potentially carrying penalties, including execution in severe cases. However, historical records show considerable variation in enforcement, with some communities exhibiting surprising tolerance, provided participants maintained public discretion and fulfilled traditional social roles. Despite these rigid regulations, evidence suggests medieval people maintained active, diverse sex lives that frequently diverged from church ideals. Court records, penitentials, medical texts, and literature all indicate that people engaged in the full spectrum of sexual behaviors despite prohibitions. The difference wasn't that medieval people had fewer sexual variations than modern humans, but that they experienced them within a radically different conceptual and moral framework. Premarital sex occurred with sufficient frequency that many communities developed pragmatic accommodations. Bundling practices allowed engaged couples to share beds with physical barriers or clothing, preventing full intercourse. Some regions recognized informal trial marriages that became official only after the woman proved fertility by becoming pregnant. Church courts routinely dealt with cases of premarital pregnancy, suggesting widespread practice despite official prohibition. Prostitution existed throughout medieval Europe in various forms, from organized brothels, sometimes municipally owned and regulated, to informal arrangements. While officially condemned, prostitution was often tolerated as a necessary evil, preventing worse sins like adultery or male homosexuality. Some cities required distinctive dress for prostitutes, not necessarily to shame them, but to identify them for potential clients while preventing confused approaches to respectable women. Sexual knowledge transmitted through multiple channels, despite church efforts to limit erotic information. Medical texts discussed sexual matters in considerable detail under the guise of health concerns. Folk traditions preserved practical sexual knowledge through oral transmission. Even religious texts inadvertently conveyed sexual information via detailed descriptions of prohibited acts in confessional manuals and sermons against sexual sin. Contraception, while officially forbidden as interference with procreation, existed in various forms with debatable effectiveness. Herbal preparations, coitus interruptus, and primitive barrier methods appear in both medical texts and court testimonies. The Church's vigorous condemnation of such practices suggests they were common enough to warrant repeated prohibition, with some historians arguing that birth control was more widely practiced than previously acknowledged. Privacy for sexual activity was a luxury few medieval people enjoyed. With multiple family members sharing single-room dwellings, intimacy required creative timing or minimal concealment rather than complete seclusion. This lack of privacy created different psychological relationships with sexuality than modern expectations, with medieval people developing higher tolerance for physical proximity during intimate acts. Sexual violence existed in complex relationship with medieval legal and social structures. Rape was technically a serious crime, but prosecution patterns revealed dramatic disparities based on social status, with attacks on lower-class women or those with questionable reputations rarely punished. Within marriage, the concept of rape didn't exist. Women were required to submit to husbands' sexual demands regardless of their own wishes, with church authorities backing husbands' marital rights. Medieval people lived with sexual contradictions that modern observers might find impossible to reconcile. The same society that produced elaborate theological arguments against sexual pleasure also created ribald fablio, comic tales, celebrating lusty priests, insatiable widows, and clever sexual trickery. Communities that publicly enforced harsh penalties for sexual transgressions simultaneously maintained open secrets about who was sleeping with whom outside sanctioned arrangements. This contradiction reflects the fundamental nature of medieval sexuality, caught between institutional attempts to control fundamental human drives and ordinary people's determination to pursue pleasure, connection, and reproduction according to their own needs and desires. The resulting sexual culture wasn't more repressed than modern sexuality, but differently regulated, with alternative patterns of compliance, resistance, and negotiation between official rules and human realities. What emerges from this examination isn't a simpler or more natural approach to sexuality, but an equally complicated system with different organizing principles. Medieval sexuality wasn't defined by ignorance or lack of diversity, but by a complex regulatory framework attempting to harness physical desire toward religious ends, an ambitious project that achieved mixed results at best, as human sexuality persistently overflowed the channels designed to contain it. Medieval relationships, the reality behind the romance. When we strip away both romantic medieval fantasies and simplistic assumptions about universal human brutality, what emerges is a relationship system adapted to its environment with terrible efficiency. Medieval relationships weren't designed for emotional fulfillment or personal growth, but for survival in conditions of extreme material scarcity, high mortality, and rigid social hierarchy. The seeming harshness of medieval relationship patterns, arranged marriages, strict gender roles, hierarchical family structures, calculated child-rearing practices, reflects not moral failure, but pragmatic adaptation to an environment where individual happiness was luxury few could afford. When starvation loomed constantly, when childbirth killed a significant percentage of mothers, when half of all children died before adulthood, relationship priorities necessarily centered on collective survival rather than personal satisfaction. This doesn't mean medieval people didn't experience love, affection, or attachment. Contemporary sources show ample evidence of genuine emotional bonds, grief at children's deaths, distress at spousal separation, joy in family celebrations. People fell passionately in love, sometimes defying family arrangements at enormous personal cost. Parents worried about their children's welfare and future prospects. Spouses developed deep attachments across decades of shared hardship. The difference lies not in the presence or absence of human emotion, but in social systems that subordinated individual feeling to collective necessity. Marriage created crucial economic alliances, regardless of personal compatibility. Parenting prioritized creating hardy survivors over emotional nurturing. Family structures maintained rigid hierarchies that optimized resource distribution for group survival. The resulting relationships weren't emotionless or loveless, but organized around different priorities than modern arrangements. Medieval relationships also operated with different assumptions about privacy, individuality, and personal fulfillment. The concept of the individual self as primary, with relationships serving personal growth and happiness, would have seemed alien and possibly horrifying to medieval people. Identity derived primarily from relational roles, daughter, wife, father, apprentice, rather than internal psychological uniqueness. Relationships weren't chosen expressions of individual preference, but essential structures within which personhood itself was defined and maintained. This system produced both tremendous resilience and what modern observers would consider routine trauma. Medieval relationships enabled human survival under conditions of extreme hardship, creating bonds forged through shared struggle against external threats. Simultaneously, they normalized interpersonal violence, exploitation of the vulnerable, and subordination of individual needs to collective demands or hierarchical authority. Perhaps most importantly, medieval relationships operated without modern assumptions about progress or improvement. Marriage, parenting, and family dynamics weren't expected to become better over time through conscious refinement or increased understanding. They were static institutions reflecting natural and divine order, to be endured rather than improved. This fundamental difference in temporal perspective created relationship patterns focused on maintaining traditional forms rather than seeking innovation or enhancement. Despite these differences, examining medieval relationships reveals certain constants in human connection. People formed attachments, experienced jealousy, sought comfort from loved ones, and mourned their loss across the centuries, separating us from medieval experience. The expressions differed dramatically, shaped by environmental constraints and cultural frameworks utterly foreign to modern sensibilities, but the underlying human needs for connection, belonging, and meaning persisted. Understanding medieval relationships neither romanticizes a brutally pragmatic system nor dismisses our ancestors as simplistically cruel. It reveals how human connection adapts to environmental demands, taking forms that may appear alien or horrifying when removed from their context, but made terrible sense within the constraints of medieval existence. In this understanding lies neither judgment nor nostalgia, but recognition of relationship patterns shaped by realities most modern humans are fortunate enough never to experience firsthand.